You're over them. You know you're better off without them. You've listed the reasons it ended. The lies, the manipulation, the moments where they made you question your own reality. You've told yourself it's done. You've explained to friends why it had to end. You don't even want them back. And yet, late at night, you're still replaying the conversations, still analyzing what they said versus what they meant, still trying to piece together how someone who claimed to care could treat you that way. You hate them, but you can't stop thinking about them. And that contradiction is what keeps you stuck. Because if you're truly over it, if you genuinely don't want them in your life, then why are they still occupying so much space in your mind? People call this weakness. They say you're holding on, that you haven't moved on. But what if the reason they're still in your head has nothing to do with wanting them back? What if you're not stuck on the person, but on something deeper they left unresolved? Because the relationship ended, but the confusion didn't. Here's what actually happens. Your mind doesn't just process experiences. It tries to make sense of them. It builds narratives. It looks for patterns. It connects cause and effect. And when something doesn't fit the pattern, when the story has gaps or contradictions, your brain flags it as incomplete. That's what toxic relationships do. They create narratives that don't make sense. Someone says they love you, then treats you like you're disposable. They apologize, then repeat the same behavior. They convince you you're the problem, then show up acting like nothing happened. Your brain is left holding contradictory data. They said they cared, but their actions said otherwise. They seemed genuine in those moments, but everything else was a lie. I felt something real, but maybe none of it was. And your mind can't let that go. Not because you're weak, but because humans need stories that make sense. We need to understand how things that felt one way turned out to be another. So your mind keeps running the analysis, replaying scenes, looking for the detail you missed, the moment where the truth was hiding, the explanation that would finally make all of it click into place. They apologized at 2 a.m., swore it would be different this time. You wanted to believe them. You needed to believe them. And 3 days later, you were back in the same argument, listening to the same excuses, wondering if you were imagining the pattern or if they were really doing it again. You weren't imagining it. But here's the problem. Toxic people don't operate on logic. Their behavior isn't a puzzle you can solve. It's chaos disguised as connection. And your brain, built to find patterns, will keep searching for coherence in a story that was never coherent to begin with. The obsession isn't really about them. It's about the questions they left unanswered. Were they lying the whole time? Or was some of it real? Did they ever actually care, or was I just useful? What did I miss? What were the signs I ignored? Why did they choose me, and then treat me like that? These aren't small questions. They're questions about reality, about whether your perception was accurate, about whether you can trust your own judgment. And until those questions get answered, they loop, not once a day, constantly. In the background of everything else you're doing. You'll be fine for hours, focused, moving forward, and then something small will trigger the loop again. A song, a place, a phrase someone uses that sounds like something they would say. You're in the grocery store. Someone 2 aisles over laughs a certain way, and suddenly you're back in your kitchen, mid-argument, watching them smile like nothing you said mattered. The loop starts again, not because you want it to, but because your nervous system still remembers what that moment felt like. And suddenly, you're back in it. Not because you miss them, but because your mind is still trying to close the file, still trying to make sense of how someone could be two completely different people. the one who made you feel seen, and the one who made you feel invisible. The problem is, you're looking for an answer that doesn't exist, because the contradiction wasn't a misunderstanding, it was the relationship. Here's the part most people get wrong. They think if you're still thinking about someone, you must still have feelings for them. But that's not how the mind works. Thinking about someone and wanting them back are not the same thing. You can hate someone and still be mentally stuck on them. Because what you're really stuck on isn't the person, it's the lack of closure. And here's the uncomfortable truth about closure. It doesn't come from them. It never will. You keep waiting for the conversation where everything finally makes sense, where they admit what they did, where they explain why, where the story gets an ending that feels complete, but that conversation will never happen. Not because they won't talk to you, but because even if they did, they wouldn't give you the truth you're looking for. Toxic people don't have insight into their own behavior. They don't see themselves clearly. They'll rewrite history, blame you, minimize what happened, or pretend they don't remember. And even if they somehow did take accountability, even if they gave you the perfect explanation, it still wouldn't feel like enough. Because closure isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you create for yourself. And right now, you're waiting for them to hand you something they don't have. So your mind stays open, still searching, still replaying, still hoping that if you analyze it enough, the answer will appear. But it won't, because the answer isn't hidden in what they said or did. The answer is accepting that some people's behavior will never make sense, and that's not a failure of your understanding. It's just the reality of who they are. But there's something even harder to admit. You're not missing the person who actually existed. You're missing the version of them you built in your head. The one who almost understood you. The one who was just damaged, not cruel. The one who would have changed if you'd just loved them better. That person was never real. Your mind created them. And here's why. Every time you replay a good moment, your brain softens the edges. You remember the night they apologized, but forget that the apology came after 3 days of silence. You remember the conversation where they seemed to finally get it, but forget that nothing changed afterward. You remember the version of them that showed up when things were easy, and your mind keeps trying to convince you that version was the real one, that the cruel version was the anomaly. But it wasn't. The kind moments were the exception. The harmful pattern was the reality. And yet your mind keeps reconstructing them, editing out the context, highlighting the good, minimizing the bad. Not because you're in denial, but because if you accept that the person you're remembering never actually existed, that you built an idealized phantom and fell in love with your own creation, then you have to face something unbearable. You weren't just rejected by them. You were rejected by someone who was never even there. The version of them you keep mourning was a projection, a fantasy built from fragments of who you hoped they'd become. And your mind is still trying to make that fantasy retroactively real, still searching for evidence that the good version was authentic, still trying to prove that what you felt wasn't based on illusion, but it was. Not because your feelings weren't real, but because the person you were feeling them for, the version who would have chosen you, valued you, protected you, never existed outside your reconstruction of them. And that's why you can't let go. Not because you miss who they were, but because you miss who you needed them to be. And admitting that the person you needed never existed means admitting that all the pain, all the effort, all the hoping was directed at a ghost. That's the part that hurts most. Not that they were toxic, but that the version of them you loved was never real to begin with. And here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Because the obsession isn't just about them. It's about you. Specifically, it's about the version of you that stayed. The one who saw the red flags and made excuses. The one who believed the apologies even after they'd been broken before. The one who tolerated behavior you now recognize as unacceptable. And part of you, the part that's still replaying everything, is trying to prove that version of yourself wasn't foolish, that you had good reasons, that the signs weren't as obvious as they seem now, that anyone in your position would have done the same thing. You're not obsessing over them. You're defending yourself from your own judgment, because if you accept that the relationship was exactly as bad as it looks in hindsight, with no hidden complexity, no misunderstood intentions, no valid justifications, then you have to face the harder question: why did I stay? And that question feels unbearable, because it means confronting the possibility that you saw the truth and ignored it, that you chose to believe the version of them they presented, even when their actions told a different story, that you stayed not because you were tricked, but because leaving felt harder than enduring. You remember the exact moment you should have left, the thing they said that crossed the line, the boundary they shattered. You told yourself you'd bring it up later. You didn't, because bringing it up meant facing the possibility that they wouldn't care. And if they didn't care, you'd have to leave. So you stayed quiet, told yourself it wasn't that bad, that you were overreacting, and the moment passed. And now you can't stop replaying it, because that was the moment your intuition screamed at you to go, and you ignored it. So your mind keeps searching for the narrative that makes your choices make sense, the explanation where you weren't naive, where they were just misunderstood, not manipulative, where your love was justified, not wasted, where you were a good person, trying to see the best in someone, not someone who ignored reality to avoid discomfort. And until you stop defending your past decisions, they'll keep living in your head, not because they matter, but because you're still trying to prove to yourself that staying mattered, that it meant something, that you weren't wrong for believing them. But here's the truth you're avoiding. You weren't wrong for believing them. You were human, and they took advantage of that. The mistake wasn't trusting someone who seemed trustworthy. The mistake was continuing to trust them after they proved they weren't. And that's not a character flaw. That's just what happens when you care about someone who's learned how to weaponize care. There's another reason toxic people stay in your head longer than they should. They didn't just hurt you. They made you doubt yourself. They convinced you that your perception was wrong, that your feelings were overreactions, that the problem was you, your sensitivity, your expectations, your inability to let things go. They told you that you overreacted, that you were too sensitive, that you made things harder than they needed to be. And part of you started to believe it, started apologizing for feelings you had every right to have, started questioning whether your memory of events was even accurate, because they sounded so certain. And you felt so confused, and even after the relationship ends, that doubt lingers. You question your own memory. Did that really happen the way I remember it? Was I being unreasonable? Maybe I was the toxic one. This is what makes toxic relationships different from regular breakups. A normal breakup hurts, but your sense of reality stays intact. You know what happened. You know why it ended. You might be sad, angry, or relieved, but you're not confused. Toxic relationships don't work that way. They end, but they leave you second-guessing everything. Were they really that bad? Or did you blow things out of proportion? Were the good moments real? Or were they just part of the manipulation? Did they actually care? Or were you always just a placeholder? And because you can't answer those questions with certainty, your mind won't let it go. It keeps circling back. Not because you miss them, but because they broke something more fundamental than your heart. They broke your trust in your own judgment. And until you rebuild that, until you stop questioning whether your experience was valid, they'll keep occupying mental space. Not as a person you want back, but as the evidence you keep re-examining, trying to prove to yourself that what you felt was real, that what happened actually happened, that you're not making it up, that you're not crazy. So what does it mean to actually move on? It doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean the memories stop appearing. It doesn't mean you'll never think about them again. Moving on means something different. It means you stop needing the story to make sense. You stop waiting for the explanation that will suddenly make all their behavior understandable. You accept that some people are contradictions, that they can be kind in one moment and cruel in the next. And that's not depth, it's instability. That the version of them you fell for and the version that hurt you weren't two different people. They were the same person. And you're allowed to walk away from that without needing to understand why they were that way. Moving on means you stop defending your past self. You stop replaying your decisions trying to justify why you stayed. You acknowledge that you stayed longer than you should have. And that's okay. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you someone who wanted to believe in people. And there's nothing wrong with that. What was wrong was their behavior, not your belief in them. Moving on means you stop letting them define your reality. You stop questioning whether what you experienced was real. You trust your memory. You trust your feelings. You stop needing them to validate what happened. Because you were there, you know what happened. And their version of events doesn't get to overwrite yours. Moving on means recognizing that the obsession was never about them. It was about you trying to reclaim the parts of yourself they destabilized. Your judgment, your trust, your sense of reality, your belief that you deserved better. And once you reclaim those things, once you stop searching for answers in someone who was never capable of giving them, that's when they stop living in your head. Not because you've forgiven them, not because you've made peace with what happened, but because you've made peace with yourself. And yourself is the only person who was ever going to give you closure. The relationship ended, but part of you stayed in it. Not emotionally, mentally. You kept running the analysis, kept searching for the moment where it all made sense, kept defending your choices, kept questioning your reality, and that's why they never really left. Not because you wanted them there, but because you were still trying to solve something that had no solution. Here's what changes everything. You stop looking for coherence in chaos. You stop expecting logic from someone who operated on impulse and self-interest. You stop needing their behavior to make sense, because it never will. And that's not a failure. That's acceptance. The story doesn't have a neat ending. The questions don't all have answers. The contradictions don't resolve. And you're allowed to walk away from that incomplete. Because completion doesn't come from understanding them. It comes from understanding that you did the best you could with the information you had. That you're not responsible for their choices. That their inability to show up the way you deserved doesn't reflect your worth. And once you accept that, once you stop trying to make sense of the senseless, they stop taking up space in your mind, not because you've moved on in some dramatic final way, but because you've redirected that energy away from analyzing them toward rebuilding yourself, And rebuilding doesn't mean becoming who you were before. It means becoming someone stronger, someone who knows what they'll tolerate and what they won't, someone who trusts their own perception, someone who doesn't need closure from people who were never capable of giving it. The version of you that keeps replaying what happened isn't stuck. They're just waiting for permission to stop searching. And that permission doesn't come from them. It comes from you. The moment you decide the story is over. Not because it makes sense, but because you're done trying to make it make sense. That's when you're free. Not from the memory, but from the obsession. And freedom doesn't feel like relief. It feels like indifference. The kind where you can think about them without spiraling. Where their name doesn't trigger the loop. Where you're no longer trying to solve the puzzle. Because you finally accepted. Some puzzles were never meant to be solved. They were just meant to be put down. And you're allowed to put this one down now. Not because you have all the answers, but because you've stopped needing them. If this made sense to you, you already know why you're here. We'll talk again.